Well, good afternoon, everyone. The H1B guy here, and today it's the H1B Guy Live, March 7th, 2025, covering the H1B Lottery for fiscal year 2026 special edition. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but it is a little after 12 p.m. Eastern Time on March 7th, 2025. And the H1B Lottery for fiscal year 2026 has officially opened. Would like to ask you, if you haven't already, to please subscribe to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube and like this video so that I can continue to produce more content like this for you. I also wanted to mention the H1B Guy offers a variety of consulting services. I help businesses and individuals solve complex work authorization issues in the recruitment process while bringing awareness to employment-based immigration benefits. If I can help you, please reach out. I'd love to hear how. And you can book an appointment directly with me via the h1bguy.com. Today's live stream is brought to you by Syndesis, the ideal plan B for high-skilled immigrants currently located in the U.S. whose status may be uncertain. If you're facing an H-1B denial or OPT expiration, don't get caught off guard. Make sure you have a plan B, and Syndesis is your answer. Well, again, the H-1B Lottery for fiscal year 2026 has officially opened as of 12 p.m. Eastern, a little over 5-6 minutes ago. Wanted to give everyone a quick history of the electronic registration time frame and how things have gone over the last 5 years. This is our 5th year in hosting a live stream on the opening day of the H-1B Lottery. Going back to March 9th, 2021, and then on March 1st, 2022, and March 1st, 2023, and last year we saw March 6th, 2024. So kind of coinciding with the first year and last year, we see March 7th of this year. Of course, those of you who are already well aware, the lottery will run through March 24th, noon, March 24th. That's a Monday. Pending that there are no technical difficulties or glitches, which is something we actually have seen over the last couple of years where USCIS actually extended the day, the deadline date by a couple of days due to some technical issues within the system. But what I wanted to start out with today is making sure that we go over and cover changes for the H-1B Lottery for fiscal year 2026. The most important changes, and of course, this coincides with what we saw last year, which is the beneficiary ID being tied to a passport or a travel document, and it's creating a unique beneficiary number. This change was put in place to help circumvent the multiple registrations, duplicate registrations that we saw 21, 22, and 23. But the change last year definitely was noticed as we saw an overall application registration volume of somewhere approximately around 475,000. So a passport and that beneficiary unique ID, which does give the beneficiary some control. If there is, for some reason, multiple petitioning employers, if selected, the beneficiary if selected does have a choice or an option to decide which petitioner they would like to apply for their new initial H-1B visa. So that's definitely a big change that we saw last year and will continue into this year. We've also seen some changes to the organizational accounts, which was implemented last year. I think this is a big step in the right direction in creating transparency across not only the internal employees, so representatives of the organization, but as well as their legal representatives. So it's been a big change that we've seen that allows for more collaboration, specifically as we've gone to digital applications, electronic filing, electronic applications on I-129s. This has been a really big step that USCIS has put in place, and it's something that we've seen that's been coming really over the last several years, is this really push to move away from paper applications, specifically for new and initial H-1B visas that organizations, that petitioning employers are submitting. For those of you who have followed this channel for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about my history with the H1B lottery and representing my previous employers. The biggest change and for the good really has been the elimination of paper applications, and they've moved the date up. So the electronic registration period that happens now, as we've seen, happens really that first week of March and typically runs for about 3 weeks in March, with selection notifications going out towards the end of the month, and then USCIS opening up the application period for 90 days starting on April 1st. Previous to 2021, so think 2020 and before, we would prepare paper applications and they would be signed off on and submitted via overnight. FedEx typically is what my organization used, to be delivered to USCIS on April 1st. And what was very common is that USCIS would receive an overwhelming amount of these paper applications within the first couple of days. So think April 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, along those lines, where then they would cut off accepting any new applications that would come in, and they would take that existing pool and then distribute the 85,000 amongst the ones that were received at the beginning of the year. However, that's changed. If we go back to the first installment of the electronic selection process, which happened in March of 2021, it required a $10 registration fee, and it was unlimited in terms of beneficiaries or individuals, candidates, if you will, could have any number of employers submit their registration for a $10 non-refundable fee. And so what we then saw over the next several years was historic H1B lottery registration rates, to the point where in fiscal year 2024 for the H1B lottery, we saw over 700,000, almost 800,000 registrations. Many of those were duplicates, multiple registrations. But in order to circumvent that, USCIS has put in place the beneficiary-centric approach, which is tied to the passport ID or travel document. They have also put measures in place, which was announced last year and became effective starting this year for this year's lottery, a registration fee, a non-refundable registration fee of $215 per registration per individual for the organization, for the petitioning organization. So if you peel that back and think about that and what that means, it is a significant increase, $205 per individual increase in the registration rate. So the registration fee. So when we go back and look at premium processing and a non-refundable registration fee, had become the two primary sources of revenue generation within USCIS. If you recall last year during this session that was on March 6th, I talked about the overall revenue generation from a $10 registration fee plus the postage that USCIS was saving, estimated to be approximately around a $5 million total in terms of 3 to 4 million in revenue generating just from the $10 non-refundable registration fee, as well as the savings and postage that previously, if we go back to 2020 and before, USCIS would have to return those applications and those checks that we would write, because we wrote physical checks to be included as part of the application. So the cost savings that has occurred over the last 5 years has been really significant in terms of return postage fees that USCIS is saving, coupled with the hundreds of thousands of registration fees that they've received that were non-refundable. So that moves me into what we'd already talked about, which is the registration fee this year for the first time is increased to $215 per individual. So we'll get to what that's going to mean from a total revenue perspective here shortly, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that this is probably, if I look at it holistically, the most significant change that has been put in place is the increase in the registration fee for this year, as well as I think the scrutiny and the doubling down on beneficiaries having multiple employers register. That's something that we're really seeing a very high scrutiny on, and a lot of advice and recommendations that are coming down is really one beneficiary, one employer approach, one petitioning employer approach, in order to eliminate and reduce risk in terms of the evaluation process. So what we do know again is that on March 24th at noon, the lottery will close as of today. Again, as I mentioned, if there's any technical difficulties or issues with system access, that could be extended potentially through the 25th or 26th. But let's assume that there are no technical difficulties. And on March 24th at noon, the H1B lottery for fiscal year 2026 will close. I would expect notifications to begin being received and pushed out as early as March 26th. That's a Wednesday, assuming there's no issues, as early as March 26th. But more likely, that would occur on the 28th or 29th. USCIS loves to hold their selections on a Thursday or Friday and push out those notifications typically on Fridays or Saturdays over the weekend. So I would expect notifications to be received somewhere between the 26th through the 29th. And the reason for that is as we look at the calendar, the application portal, historically, as we've seen, for those that are selected, will start and open on April 1st and run for 90 days through June 30th. So in order for USCIS to create those notifications to allow for the petitioning employers to then begin preparing digital applications within their organizational accounts, those notifications have to go out the 28th or 29th of March in order to give employers enough time over those next couple of days to be prepared to submit those applications beginning on April 1st. So I think that's something just to be aware of as we look at the overall timeline. Again, as we've seen over the last few years, it's definitely something that can change over time. So again, we'll continue to monitor it and keep everyone up to speed. I wanted to just take a quick little pause and remind you, I do see some questions in the chat. If you have any questions, I would love for you to put those in the chat, and I will get to those as we go along throughout the course of the conversation here. Also, if you have any H1B lottery stories that you'd like to tell, number of attempts that you're currently on over the last few years, or how many times that you weren't selected. The biggest thing for us is that we want to create a forum here and an opportunity to share those personal stories. It is something where this only comes around once a year. There are only 85,000 visas made available annually for H1Bs for non-exempt employers. And that breaks down to 65,000 for those with international degrees, and then another additional 20,000 for those in the advanced U.S. degree category, which equals a total of 85,000 visas that USCIS is congressionally mandated to issue on an annual basis. So if you'd love to put any questions in the chat, I will get to those, and would love to hear number of H-1B attempts that you may be on, or any H-1B stories, good, bad, and ugly, that you would like to share. So please drop those in the chat as we continue. But I know one of the biggest questions, and Ashok, I see your question. That's what is the expected applications for this year? Back in January, for the H1B Guy post that I do every year, titled H1B Lottery for fiscal year 2026, what you need to know. I'm going to stick with what I predicted in that post, which is to say I expect there to be somewhere around 400,000 or just north of 400,000. I also mentioned the same in my live stream with Sophie Alcorn from Alcorn Immigration. Sophie wasn't quite as bullish on the number of applications. From my perspective, she felt like it was going to be a little bit lower total number of overall registrations. But again, in terms of demand, it continues to remain very high. I know I've been having conversations with a lot of you over the last few weeks, discussing how your employer is going to go about registration and sponsoring you in this year's lottery. So again, I still believe that we're going to see north of 400,000. The value of the H-1B visa continues to remain at an all-time historic high. There is only 85,000 that are made available annually. And when we look at, typically the number of international students that exist at any given time in the US is somewhere north of 200,000. We continue to see demand not only here domestically, but internationally as well. So again, Ashok, to answer your question, I'm expecting over 400,000 potentially registrations for this year. Again, there's a 3-week period for that to occur, but I'd love to know what you think, Ashok. Do you think we're going to see over 400,000? Do you think that number is going to be above or below that? The other thing that I mentioned to and alluded to earlier that I wanted to talk about, and that is really the revenue that USCIS will generate from the lottery from fiscal year 2026. This is, of course, based on the fact that I am predicting over 400,000 applications or registrations. So we'll just leave it at there was going to be approximately 400,000 electronic submissions, registrations received by USCIS from petitioning employers on behalf of beneficiaries. If that's the case, with the increased fee of $215 per registration, you're looking at approximately $86 million. I'm going to say that again. $86 million in revenue just by simply increasing the fee to $215. And that's a non-refundable $215 fee. And as I talked about earlier in today's stream, last year that was somewhere around 4-ish to 5-ish million that they received in revenue based on a $10 non-refundable fee. So when we look at what that means, it's really just it's an eye-popping, staggering statistic. $86 million in non-refundable registration fees for the H1B lottery is an incredible number. And literally when we compare that year over year, it's approximately an $80 million increase in year over year revenue by increasing the fee $205 to $215. A lot of you are curious about probability of being selected. This can be very difficult to calculate because of the 20,000 that's issued in the advanced degree category and because of the 65,000 that's issued in the remaining categories, international degrees and more than 10 years of experience type registrations that we see. But I'm going to guess that the probability is somewhere around 20% is my guess for this year. I've seen estimates as low as 15 to 16% and as high as 22%. But I think that is something that will be based on the number of registrations because we know that the 85,000 is a static number. It's not going to increase. It's just going to really be a matter of the number of registrations that USCIS is going to receive over the next 3 weeks. But again, if we look at an estimated range of somewhere between 15 to 22% probability of being selected, the margin is very low. And so the probability of being selected is very low. And again, we want to be upfront and honest here in terms of this being a viable option, not only for you, the individual, but for your employer. It's an expense. Not only is the registration fee non-refundable, but when we look at individuals that are selected, if we count in legal and filing fees, that can be approximated to be somewhere around $5,500 to $6,000 in total cost and expense that is incurred by the petitioning employer. So the fees continue to rise, and rightfully so. $10 non-refundable registration fee was definitely a very low barrier. But I'm really curious to see what the impact will be on the $215. As I've talked about over the last year and a half, I believe they could raise the registration fee upwards of $500 to $1,000, and we would still see 250,000 plus registrations. I know that that can be pretty difficult to comprehend, but the reality is the demand on talent and the demand on international talent remains extremely high, and will continue to do so until we look at reform, not only surrounding the H-1B visa, but to get into the green card backlog that currently exists, and reform around that that's going to create clearer paths to permanent residency here for high skilled immigrants in the U.S. Just a reminder, if you have any other questions or comments, please drop those in the chat. Would love to hear your H-1B lottery stories, the number of attempts that you're currently on this year. If you have any questions, please throw those in there, and I will get to those here in the next few minutes. Would love to hear from you in terms of what you're hearing and seeing as well. The last point that I wanted to talk about, and this is something that has been a very popular subject over the last 5 years, and that is how many H-1B lotteries will be held. Over the last few years, this is something that I have gotten completely wrong multiple times, albeit whether that is a second lottery being held or a second lottery not being held. But I think, as we've seen traditionally here over the last few years, there is absolutely a possibility of a second lottery being held, regardless of regardless of the number of registrations that we've seen, because it really comes back to application rates. And as we've seen in the last few years, USCIS has selected upwards of 100, 110, 115,000 registrations in order to fulfill that 85,000. And even then, those application rates have been somewhere in the 70 percentile and have created the necessity to have a second selection. Historically, that has been held end of July, beginning of August. So I would say with some level of confidence, I believe that there will be a small second lottery held for this year. And again, if we go back and look at the time frame around that, as we know, the application window will close on or around June 30th. So I would believe that notifications would be sent out if a second selection was to be held somewhere around that last week of July, and then moving into that first or second week of August. So I feel pretty comfortable in saying that there will be at least a need to have another second, albeit a much smaller random selection held that will fulfill the congressionally mandated 85,000 H-1B visas that need to be issued annually. So Saeed asks, can I tell what documents are required to register for the lottery? Of course, Saeed, this is employer driven. So your employer or their legal representative will need to create an organizational account if they do not already have one. And at a minimum, you will need to provide them with a passport, because your unique passport ID is what creates your unique beneficiary ID within the My USCIS portal. So at a minimum, just to start out with, a passport, and potentially, if you're here in the US or if you're outside of the US, an offer for employment would be another thing that you may want to go ahead and have, but USCIS doesn't require that initially in the registration. It really is about your employer submitting that registration on your behalf and paying that $215 non-refundable fee. So I hope that helps with that question. Another question that I get asked a lot, and I wanted to bring up here, is if you do have multiple employers that want to register you in the lottery, what is the best approach for that? And so this question has become very popular since they've gone to the beneficiary-centric ID approach. And that really is my recommendation to you. Would go back to the one employer, one registration. But if for some reason you feel very strongly about having multiple employers submit a registration on your behalf, I would make sure that you understand your options in terms of who is going to provide you with what we would call the best offer of employment. And that means not only the responsibilities, but that includes compensation, location, company, industry and verticals that they work in, and how that fits with your skill set and your growth for projection. But if I were to give you any advice, it would be one petitioning employer, one registration on your behalf. While that does not increase your probability of selection, it will give you a much cleaner line. And as we've heard with the current administration that's now in office, there's going to be a lot more scrutiny put on beneficiaries that have multiple registrations attached to their passport or travel document ID. But really good question, and I hope that helps answer it. I have a few more minutes here. Would love to take a couple of more questions, but one of the things that we've talked about a lot is this concept of whether or not the H-1B lottery, the total number of H-1B visas, should be increased year over year. And as I've said, that we cannot look at increasing the number of H-1B visas that are issued annually without first addressing the green card backlog. And that is to say that the INA, as it currently exists, and the 140,000 employment-based visas that are issued annually with a percentage based on country of birth has to be addressed. And the reason for that is we look at the percentage of H-1B visas that go to individuals from China every year hovers between 80 to 90% of the totality of H-1B visas that's issued every year. And so in order for us to have a pathway that is clear for permanent residency on the employment-based side, we first need to address the green card backlog and the issues that surround that. But also, in order for us to increase our talent access to those individuals that currently are seeking to live and work in the U.S. on an H-1B visa, and those employers that need those individuals to fulfill talent gaps and demand on talent access that currently exist and will continue to exist, the H-1B visa is going to be the primary solution and the primary mechanism that allow for high-skilled international not only students, but folks that are living and working outside of the U.S., a gateway and a pathway to come and live and work here in the U.S. So we're coming up on the half hour here. Really appreciate everyone who has taken time to drop a question here in the chat. And thank you for jumping in here on my live stream today. Really excited about some of the changes that have been put in place for the H-1B lottery for fiscal year 2026. And we'll definitely keep our eyes on the data as it comes out, as USCIS releases it. But just again, a quick recap here. The lottery opened today, a little afternoon on March 7th, 2025, and is slated to run through March 24th at noon Eastern. I'm expecting somewhere around 400,000 total registrations to be submitted. Still utilizing a beneficiary-centric approach, which requires a passport or travel document ID. I am expecting, based on the 400,000 potential registrations and the increase of the registration fee to $215, non-refundable per individual, that USCIS will create approximately $86 million in revenue just from the H-1B lottery registration. I do believe there will be a second lottery held sometime towards the end of July, beginning of August, and that will be a very small selection to allow USCIS to fulfill the congressionally mandated issuance of 85,000 visas annually. But with all of that being said, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who took time to jump in here to my live stream, and those of you who may be watching this at a later time and date. I really appreciate your support. I wanted to remind everyone that today's live stream was brought to you by Syndesis, the ideal plan B for high-skilled immigrants currently located in the U.S. whose status may be uncertain. If you're facing an H-1B denial or OPT expiration, don't get caught off guard. Make sure you have a plan B, and Syndesis is your answer. They'll gladly help you navigate the process. And if you'd like to find out more, please be sure to use the link in the video description below. If you haven't already, want to ask you to please like this video. Make sure you're subscribed to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube and click the bell for notifications so that you're notified anytime we post new content here to this channel. If you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to watch my live stream. I really appreciate your support. Please make sure you're following me on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Check out the H1BGuy.com for more industry news and articles, and over 5 years of posts that currently exist on that site, or almost 5 years of posts that currently exist on that site. I'm Robert, the H1B Guy, your global source for all things H1.